When the revolution came to power, I was 14 years old, and I looked out the window from a balcony, and I saw the bearded young men in the trucks, and I wanted to put a Cuban flag on the window, and my mother told me not to because who knows, maybe Batista was still around. And I was one of those Cubans among many millions of Cubans that believe in Fidel Castro and in the revolution. And less than 2 years later, when at the high school where I was, they changed the teachers, and the teachers began to talk about Marxism, Leninism, and the need for the masses to be in charge of a means of production. And I went to my Boy Scouts meeting one afternoon, and there was a new Scout master, and we were no longer Boy Scouts but pioneros. I figured, well, I think I have been betrayed. And from that very early age, I said to myself, you know, maybe we Cubans believe and it's not true, and we have to do something about it. In '59, when Castro came to power, I was 15. No, not quite 15. I was 14. Well, it didn't go very well. One of the first things that I did was I was going to El Instituto de La Habana. As all Cubans know, is the high school where Jose Marti attended, and I used to get into arguments. Of all teachers, a teacher that was teaching Spanish grammar, but she spent all her time talking about the Soviet Union and the problems of capitalism, and trying to present Jose Marti as a Marxist. And I knew that Jose Marti was not a Marxist because I have read what Marti has said about Marx. And Marti has said that that Marx was a good man because he cared about the poor, but that he was wrong when he preached hate and getting men against other men. So I knew that wasn't true. Anyway, she was a little difficult. Marxists are not used to have people challenge or question their beliefs. And when you're a student, is hard. We were also forced to attend all kinds of assemblies. And one day we heard the rumor that there had been some trouble a few blocks away in the Jose Marti statue in Central Park. And we went over there, and what had happened, I later discovered, was that Mikoyan, the Russian, had gone to Cuba and put a wreath in the statue, and then a group of university students had gone over there and put another wreath, and then the police came and beat them up. And so I got there, but all of that had happened hours earlier, and the statue was surrounded by a bunch of men, I guess, probably from the Communist Party. They were all of that kind of ideological persuasion. And I began arguing with them. And I guess people began to shout, and all I know is that at one moment the president of the student association of the institute where I was suddenly showed up at my side, grabbed me by the hand, and said, "Come on, you gotta get back to class." And I guess he probably meant well and saved me from maybe, I guess the government didn't want to, they had enough trouble with the college or the university student. They didn't want to get into trouble with, teenagers or something. The police came to our apartment. To this day, I don't know why they came in. My mother and my father were not. They worked. They both worked, and they were not there. And I was there with my little sister, who's 2 years younger than I am. And they knocked at the door. I opened the door. They said that they want the search, un registro. And I guess early on I already read too many books or something, and I said, well, can I have your mandamiento judicial? Can I have your judicial writ? And I remember that the cop went, pushed me like that, and I fell on the sofa. And I forgot the exact words, but I remember the meaning. The meaning was, you stay in that sofa and don't open your mouth. And I said, this is against the law. And the cop said, I am the law. So they went through the house. They didn't find anything. And a few days after that, I guess, I was going around being so proud that I stood up to the police that my parents decided, well, for his own good and for the good of the family, it's better if he's not hanging around here much longer, and they sent me to Florida to live with my godparents. Like most Cubans, on January 6 or 7, whenever it was that Fidel got to Havana, the consensus was, this is a new beginning, it's going to be fine, Batista's gone, and Fidel had made many promises, and Fidel, of course, could not lie to the Cuban people. He kept saying that he was telling the truth, and he said there were going to be elections within 18 months, and he said that never again young Cubans could be sent to political prisons, and he said that there would never again be censorship or corruption, and so everything seemed possible. Everything, that was one of those periods, days, perhaps weeks, maybe months, in which a whole nation was spellbound by this great public speaker that could convince anybody of anything. And so, yeah, my family was, we were not involved in the struggle against Batista, but 90 or more percent of Cubans were not involved. My dad had come from Spain. He was an exile from Franco's Spain. So if anything, he was willing to at least give the benefit of the doubt to the new regime. Nobody liked Batista. So that's the way. We were not. My father was I guess, un encargado, the superintendent, whatever you call it here. Anyway, I helped my dad paint empty apartments, collect the garbage, open apartments for people who forgot their keys, that kind of thing. Yeah, I was in Florida for only a few months. I went to New York. I worked as a dishwasher, as a busboy, as a waiter. Eventually my family managed to get out of Cuba. My mother and my two sisters through Spain, and we got reunited on Christmas Eve of 1961, I think. I think that's what it was. I left Cuba in November of 1960, so almost 2 years after Castro came to power.
Okay. And
It
then
didn't take long. It didn't take long for these magnificent dream to turn sour, and people began to wonder about the new executions and the confiscation, not only of American property, but of Cuban property, of newspapers, of the only Americans we knew were a couple that have moved. You talk about bad timing. They went to Cuba in '59 some point, and they live in an apartment in the building where we live. And I used to know all the details, but he went to Cuba. I think they were retired teachers or something like that. They have saved some money, and they had bought some machinery, and they're going to start making dresses. And so it was sort of a small business. But not long after Castro came to power, they went back to the States. I guess I don't know the details. I assume the government took over. I've been involved in human rights in Cuba all the way back to my college days. I was involved in an organization called Abdallah, which at the time I was with them was strictly a college, university students coalition. I was at Rutgers then in New Brunswick. The most exciting thing we ever did in Abdallah when I was there was 8 or 9, 7 or 8 students chained themselves at the United Nations Security Council, I guess, and there was a lot of media, TV, and the New York Times, and Page 3, and Daily News. Yeah, I was one of them. The Daily News had us on the front page, and a big picture, and said, "With no love for Fidel." And again, see, it's very interesting that the model for that was Martin Luther King. So we organized our own sit-in. We chained ourselves to the chairs so they couldn't push us easily out. They had to come with big cutting, like scissors or something. And we ended up going to jail, and they want to let the women out, but they want to keep us in. And then the women said that they wouldn't leave without us. And there were a couple of hundred Cuban students outside the police station. Anyway, they let us go. And then we went to court eventually, and we pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor, some disturbing peace or something. And we paid $30. And that was it. I think it was 1968. Don't be 100% sure of any of these dates and stuff, because my memory is not what it used to be. But I think it was 1968. Well, I was in Abdallah Abdallah is the title of a poem that Jose Marti wrote of an Arab prince who dies for his country. After that, I was involved with the Rutgers Cuban Students Association. We're very much we're very active. We had an exhibit at the student center, and one evening, I guess a group of students that didn't like us went in there and destroyed the exhibit, and created a little bit of concern about the lack of academic freedom or whatever. And then I came to Georgetown, and I helped organize the Georgetown University Cuban Students Association, where I was involved for many years. And then out of that, a group called of Human Rights, por los Derechos Humanos, was organized, and it was a tremendous effort because it was a coalition of all folks who were retired and had a lot of time, and the students. So we had both ends of the spectrum, the very young and the very old. And the chairman of the group was a lady named Elena Mederos. I have her picture around here. She was the grand old lady of human rights in Cuba. In the 1920s, she was fighting for the right of women to vote. She's one of the first women to drive a car. And when Batista came to power in '52, she quickly joined the civic resistance and drove through the countryside with a jeep full of bananas or mangoes or whatever it was, and underneath those were weapons that she was taken to the rebels. And she was such a sweet lady that I guess the La Guardia Rural, or the Batista's military, didn't pay much attention to her. When Castro came to power, she became Minister of Social Welfare. And before that, during the Prio government, before Batista's coup, I think she was working at the United Nations as a Cuban diplomat. And when Batista had his military coup on March 10th, 1952, of course, she resigned her post and returned to Cuba. I am very optimistic, and the democracy movement in Cuba, one has to look back and see the various stages of the opposition to the Castro dictatorship. For many years, for example, when the mothers or wives of political prisoners would go to cárceles y prisiones, which is the government department that handles prisons and jails. They were basically told to go home and be quiet because otherwise their loved ones would suffer. And so the peaceful opposition within Cuba was very, very limited. Those were horrible days. Even some of the people who were still in the Cuban government remember those days as Stalinist days. But a lot have changed. When the Castro brothers, or when Fidel Castro decided to send to prison 75 human rights activists, all of them were identified as prisoners of conscience by Amnesty International. And at the time, some academics, professors in the United States, people who followed Cuba, were saying that, well, this is the end of the opposition movement. It'll take many, many years for the opposition to recover. Frankly, what happened then is that, well, all these people were in prison, their wives, their mothers, their daughters began to go to church on Sunday, all dressed in white, holding flowers, and it's a challenge to the authorities that all of a sudden were confronted with a difficult situation, what to do with a bunch of women that were just walking down the street to church, but everybody knew that they were a symbol of resistance. And I don't know if you remember, but many years ago, the Cuban government used to Fidel used to call the opposition grupúsculos, which is a pejorative term of a very small group. Well, those days are long gone, and now some of the opposition leaders, like Ioanni Sanchez, are recognized by foreign universities, by governments. The ladies in white received the Sakharov Award from the European Union. At one point, the Castros decided that they want to, we used to say that many years ago they wanted to export the revolution, and now sort of tongue-in-cheek some of us are saying they want to export the opposition. But the problem is that it takes two to tango, and there are some leaders of it in the opposition who are saying no. We were born in Cuba, and God wanted us to be Cubans, and we're going to stay here. And their courage and the international support has been such that the Cuban government has to agree to allow some of them to remain in prison in Cuba, where nevertheless they're under continuous harassment, beatings. Their wives or families are fired from their jobs. Most of the jobs in Cuba are government control. Their children are expelled from school. So it's not a happy picture. In a place like the United States, you want to get into politics, and it's an interesting career. You have many friends. You try to get people to support you. In Cuba, when you decide to get involved in politics, other than in the government, Communist Party, what you bring to you and to your family is the wrath of the regime, misery, poverty, despite what the Cuban government says about the opposition being simply a tool of the United States. I think every Cuban has to decide whether, given his or her conditions, whether to stay in Cuba or get out of Cuba. I remember years ago talking to a opposition leader in Oriente province, who told me that he was going to his trial was about to start in a week or so. And I said, well, is that the end of your organization? I said, no. And he put somebody else on the phone, another young man who was ready to, knowing that the leader of the organization was going to be on trial and probably sentenced to many years in prison. There was another Cuban willing to step up to the plate and carry the flag. So every day that passes, the opposition grows stronger. Every day that passes, the regime understands that there's no future for them or for the Communist Party in Cuba. I believe that those within Cuba in the government who are the hardliners in the regime look at Cuba the way Adolf Hitler looked at Germany in late 1944 or early 45. They lost the war. Hitler lost the war. It's not a question of the end of the regime, but when the regime would end. And for, like in Hitler's case, for Raúl and the others, every day that they remain in power is a victory. Every week that they remain in power, every month that they remain in power. They know that at the very end, they know exactly that the Cuban people have rejected for many years the revolution, that they had a chance to build a better country with the support of most Cubans. And instead of that, Fidel Castro and his brother decided that they wanted to be all powerful and to run the country as if it was a private farm. And that's where we are today.
And how did you?
Well, that tells you something, doesn't it? A government that is puts the opposition under surveillance. And what has the Cuban government come up after all these years, after 50 years? The 75 that went to prison are being released, where most of them were released, all of them were released recently, should not have been in prison in the first place. The crimes that they were charged with are not crimes in any civilized society. There were no weapons, there were no plans, there was no violence or plan for any kind of violent outburst. The Cuban government has a problem because even within the Cuban government, even within the military, there are people who I'm sure are saying, why do we have to go out and beat up a bunch of women carrying flowers? And more important than that, it is true that Raúl and Fidel ran Cuba as a private farm, but they obviously do not have the kind of business sense that their parents had. If Fidel's mother and Fidel's father were running Cuba as a farm, I'm sure Cuba would be a very, very productive farm. Instead, the engine of progress in Cuba for 200 years, the sugar industry, is no more as a result of Fidel Castro's ignorance or his whims. He wanted to turn Cuba into the biggest producer of sugar in the world, in the history of the world, in 1970 when he failed. Then he decided that he had nothing to do with sugar in the future. And if Fidel had nothing to do with sugar in the future, that industry had to die, and it did. President Obama presents a very difficult issue for the Castro brothers. Not because of what he could do. After all, President Obama has offered to extend a hand of friendship in exchange for having the Castro brothers open their fist in order to have more normal relations with Cuba. So it's not what Obama could do that is a threat. As a matter of fact, many of the things that Obama has agreed to do, in some fashion, the unintended consequences that the Cuban government is getting millions and millions of dollars because any money that is sent to Cuba, since the Castro brothers again run the country as a private farm or as a company town, every Cuban who needs to buy an electric appliance has to go to a Cuban government store, or any Cuban who wants to buy some clothing or whatever. So there's no independent trade or commerce of any significance inside Cuba. But it's not what Mr. Obama is doing that is a problem for the Castro brothers. Is who he is. Mr. Obama is a black American who was first elected to the Senate of the United States in a state where, again, the blacks are a minority, in a country where blacks are a minority. Castro and his group having telling the Cuban people for 50 years that everything bad is that the source of everything bad is the United States. That blacks in America are still where they were in the 1940s or 1950s in the American South. That black children in the United States cannot go to a beach or cannot go to a good school, or that they're mistreated. Suddenly there's a black American who's president, who's not from a rich family and attended very important schools, and who is a symbol not only in the United States but around the world, and in Cuba, where the majority, the tremendous irony of a black in the White House, while blacks, who are the majority of the population in Cuba, are nowhere any of the great positions of power, is something that the Cuban government has no way of explaining. And when an American black boy or girl look up and they see, well, here's a black man in the president. When a Cuban black boy or girl, what do they see? The leadership is old and white. And I'm sure that has, and despite all the rhetoric, the problem is that the rhetoric has come into conflict with reality. And they know that, for example, in order to get a better job in a hotel, if you're a dark black person, you're not likely to get a job in Cuba. And that in the diplomatic corps, the story was that one of the historical comandantes, when Fidel many years ago went on a tour, a foreign tour, came along, a black man came along with Fidel while Fidel visited Africa. But when Fidel flew over to Europe, a black man was sent back to Cuba. The majority of Cubans, again, are non-white, and not only there are problems in Cuba, but they are not allowed to talk about those problems. And again, that's one of the tremendous challenges that the Obama administration presents to Havana, because the president doesn't say that the United States is perfect. The president says that a lot has to change, that he and the American people welcome change, and that when something goes wrong, people can talk about it. People can write letters to the newspaper, or they could write in the newspaper, or they could vote for a different candidate. But in Cuba, when things go wrong, if you complain about it, you go to prison. And so that's a big difference between Cuba, North Korea, Syria, Zimbabwe, maybe Saudi Arabia, and other countries like Spain, the United States, Costa Rica, the Czech Republic, other democracies. I think the senator, like most politicians, means well, but perhaps he does not have a good grasp of the importance of pro-democracy programs in Cuba. When the two key congressional staffers went to Cuba a couple of years ago, they asked a Cuban official what the United States had to do in order to improve relations, and the Cuban government said, and it was reported in the published report by Senator Lugar, Cuban government said that they wanted TV and Radio Marti to be ended and the pro-democracy programs to end. And the Cuban government is so fearful of these kinds of programs that Alan Gross, an American subcontractor, was sentenced a year ago, many months ago, to 15 years in prison for the crime, which is not a crime anywhere in the civilized world, of taking a laptop and a satellite telephone and giving it away. In most countries, if anything, that would have been sort of a customs issue of paying for a tax or something along those lines. And so the Cuban government is afraid of the Cuban people. And the pro-democracy programs that the Cuba government objects so much are very similar to the pro-democracy programs that were, for example, General Pinochet complained about the U.S. Congress providing funds to the campaign, the no campaign, the campaign that the Chileans had saying no to the dictatorship. And Pinochet was saying that it was interfering in the internal affairs of Chile. Mr. Castro, who has spent a lifetime interfering in not by sending laptops and printers or books, but by sending weapons and armies around the world, I guess has a bad memory. There were Cuban terrorists, violent groups supported by Cuba in Panama, in Nicaragua, in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Uruguay, in Chile, in Argentina, in Bolivia, in the Golan Heights during the one of the Arab-Israeli wars. Fidel supported Carlos, the infamous Venezuelan terrorist, but Fidel calls that internationalism. Internacionalismo proletario, proletariat internationalism, and then he complains about but every government has a right to promote ideas anywhere around the world, and the Cubans, like the people in Poland under communism, have the right to receive information and to send information across borders. And that's so the Cuban government decrees are in violation of international law. Havana wants to make this thing a unique thing. It's not unique at all. When Jaruzelski declared the martial law in Poland, there was a huge Polish flag that covered the whole facade of the AFL-CIO building in Washington. When I began to go around talking to members of Congress and media in Washington when I was a student at Georgetown in the 1970s, there were many organizations, and there's still some, that oppose General Pinochet, that oppose right-wing dictatorships around the world. And so the Cuban government has a very difficult time because Fidel and Raúl and his team claim that any Cuban who disagrees with the Cuban government on anything, whether it is having more than one political party, whether it is wanting to travel freely in and out of the country, whether it is the right of assembly, of bringing 50 Cubans into a park. The Cuban government says that anyone who dares to say something against the government, it's an enemy of the people, a lackey of the United States, instrument of a foreign power. This is really nonsense. The question that some journalists ought to ask, either Fidel or Raul at some point, is to give an example of 1, 2, 3 Cubans who are decent human beings, that are not on the pay of a foreign government, that are honest, and that might be mistaken, but they have different views about the regime and the future of Cuba. And the Cuban government is in a situation where they don't have answer to that question or to many other questions. Well, first of all, I would not use the way aggressiveness or aggressive in regard to U.S. policy to Cuba. In comparison to what Cuba has done, I think American policy has been, at least after Bay of Pigs, very, very minimal in its response. It is Fidel Castro, after all, who, according to Nikita Khrushchev in his memoirs, asked the Russians to drop an atomic weapon on the United States. And it is Fidel Castro who has, I don't think anybody can talk about Latin America today. No one can talk about Venezuela or Bolivia or Nicaragua without some reference to Fidel Castro and the support and the logistical support that he gave those people. So there's nothing aggressive about. I wish the policies of the Soviet Union in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s were at the same level of aggressiveness, or the policies of Fidel Castro when he, when Che went to kill and get killed in Bolivia and in Africa. Maybe they should have been engaged in distributing books and radios and manuscripts and documents about human rights instead of manuals of war and destruction. So I don't think the American policy is aggressive at all. If anything, let me first of all say that although, and I think you had it on your blog, I believe that American policy makers mean well, but that not enough is being done. I am not one of those who blame the United States for everything's wrong in the world. First of all, it's not true. Also, I am not one of those who believe that everything that Washington does needs to be applauded. I have problems with American policy in regard to Cuba. I have problems with the notion that a Cuban that is desperate to get on a raft and try to reach the United States is now picked up and returned to a place where there are no human rights. And I wonder, being a political scientist, what would have been what the consequences would have been if the Germans crossing the Berlin Wall had been grabbed by the West Germans and returned to the communist Germany. So there are problems with U.S. policy. The magnificent thing about America, however, is that even in those areas, people like me, anybody, and whether you're an American or not, you could write, you could talk, you could try to change the policy. The policy of the administration of the Obama administration was good, or is good in one sense. It demonstrated to anybody, if any demonstration was needed, that it's not Washington, that Washington is not the obstacle to have normal relations that could be beneficial to both Cuba and the United States. The president has gone out of his way to allow Cuban Americans to go to Cuba, monies to be sent to Cuba. But I am sorry to say that those efforts by the president are probably interpreted by some key figures in Havana as a weakness to take advantage of. The historical record is clear. Whether Raúl Castro is going to act differently, I doubt it. He's part of the same regime. It was Raúl Castro who was the Minister of the Armed Forces when the Cuban MiGs destroyed 2 small civilian aircraft in the Florida Straits. Mr. General Castro, Raúl, has blood in his hands, and unlike Gaddafi, he has yet to own up to it. What they did in Cuba was to give medals to the officers who pulled the trigger. In the history of the relation between the United States and Cuba, there seems to be a pattern that whenever the U.S., for example, when Henry Kissinger, many years ago, went to the OAS and said anybody who wants to have normal relations with Cuba can do so, and lifted the idea of having a hemispheric-wide sanction system, the Havana basically, after that, went and began deployment of armies in Africa. When President Jimmy Carter, and I don't think there has ever been another president so willing to compromise, so willing to put himself in the shoes of the adversary, when he went ahead and opened up intersections in Havana and the Cubans in Washington, then again, Cuban armies were deployed under Soviet command in Africa. The effort by the president Obama it could be said that the most important response to that has been the imprisonment of an American in Cuba. I think cannot speak for the administration, but I assume that the president sees that imprisonment slap in his face after having done so much to try to reach an accommodation. The Cuban government doesn't understand what the word compromise is. The Cuban government believes that it's all or nothing, all for them and nothing for the others. And unless the United States is willing to stand up, I used to tell a friend of mine years ago, after Jean Kirkpatrick, my teacher, went to the United Nations, she got there and she called all the diplomats and told them to take off the "Kick Me" sign from their backs. She said, "You've been wearing a 'Kick Me' sign on your backs, and everywhere where the U.S. went, you got kicked. And it's a new administration. Take off the sign." And another way of saying that is that apparently some folks who deal with Cuba didn't learn what I learned in elementary school, that when you in recess you go to the yard to play and you have your lunch money, and if a bully comes by and wants to take it away from you, if you let them take it away from you, you'll be giving away your lunch money every day. And so that lesson of the lunch money is something that American diplomats should take to heart. Castro understands force. If the imprisonment of Alan Gross would result in some price to be paid by the Cuban government, then Alan Gross would be released. Furthermore, it makes no sense for the administration to be encouraging Americans, Cuban Americans, and other Americans who now go on what I guess they call purposeful travel to the island, while at the same time saying that they hope that by going to Cuba that will encourage the Cubans, inform the Cubans about democracy and so on. To be doing that while one American is in prison, sentenced to 15 years. I believe the last time I checked he had lost around 90 pounds. And he's in prison. Why is the United States, what does the United States have an intersection in Havana, a diplomatic mission that is bigger than the Canadians or the Russians or the Spanish, if they cannot do anything to prevent the regime from sentencing somebody to 15 years in prison for doing something that is not a crime anywhere in the world? I think the administration should get tougher with the Cuban regime. I think the administration ought to do everything it can to help Cuba. And to help Cuba means, for example, that if Joanny Sanchez has been given an award by Columbia University in New York, and she's not allowed to travel to New York, then any of the Cuban government, any of these folks that the Cuban government love to send to the United States to talk about, to badmouth the United States, should be put on hold. The United States ought to, if Cuba wants to, the Castro wants to hold Alan Gross hostage. The United States is not Cuba, but the United States should say, we have a list of all these people, 100, 200, 300, whatever. As time goes by, all these folks have asked for a visa to come to the United States, to attend a conference at a university, to come to some artistic, why should Cuban musicians, basically Cuban government musicians, be singing and dancing in New York while an American remains in prison that way in Cuba? All of those cultural exchanges that the Cuban government wants should be put on hold. They should not be canceled, they should be suspended, and say, at one point when Fidel Castro understands that there are 2,500 of his people that cannot travel to the United States, he might decide that it's worthwhile allowing Mr. Gross to come home. And Gross was not engaged in any violence. There's no charge that he was engaged in violence. There's no charge that he did anything but give away a laptop and a satellite telephone. Yeah, I would like simply to ask, and maybe leave the question hanging, about American media, about the unwillingness of American journalists and other journalists to treat the Cuban government the way they treat other governments. I guess Jean Kirkpatrick was right when she talked about dictatorship and double standards. CNN broadcasts from Cuba, yet the Cubans are not allowed to watch CNN. Why shouldn't the people who have bureaus in Cuba, the media has bureaus in Cuba, as part of their deal say, we're going to distribute a couple of hundred, couple of thousand monthly magazines or newspapers or whatever to the Cuban people? why shouldn't some Cuban go to any Cuban go to the office of the New York Times in Havana and get a copy of the newspaper? And isn't the not particularly singling out the Times, but a newspaper who obeys the rules that they can report from Cuba, but their work cannot be widely distributed in Cuba, isn't that newspaper in fact being an accomplice of the regime?